Back to the daily grind, and shout out to the full-time patrons. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back bagel biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
What is up, full-time family? It is time for the UFC Utica full main card breakdown and predictions. Actually, it's the full fight cards, even the early fight pass and the Fox Sports 1 predictions as well and breakdown. I've got those over on Patreon, which you can check out by clicking the link in the description, patreon.com/fulltimemma. And sorry for the delay on these predictions. They would have probably been out about 5-6 hours earlier, but I've been dealing with some baby back bagel biting bullshit. If you're nosy, man, fuck it, I'm gonna tell y'all because y'all part of the family. My mom tried to steal some shit from my fucking girl. I had to go be the mediator and get the shit back. Some shit was still missing. I had to drive an hour away and drive back. It was a bunch of straight bullshit, but now we're back and it's time to get to these predictions. So let's jump into the first fight of the night between Gian Villante and Smiling Sam Alvey. This is a fight Smiling Sam Alvey called for after his successful light heavyweight debut in the UFC. He was, Gian Villante, you're a cool guy, I'm a cool guy, it'd be an honor to share like blood with you. It was a super dope or share the octagon with you, whatever he said, you know, like super dope call out by Sam Alvey, and it looks like he got his wish. Sam Alvey is 6-2 in his last 8 fights, and he's got 42 pro fights at only 32 years old with strong wrestling base, but he's also got heavy hands as he KO'd Marcin Prochnia in his light heavyweight debut. That's when Sam Alvey called out Gian Villante. Now he's got his wish against the fellow 32-year-old who has not been as active, but is powerful and explosive, and is coming off of a split decision win over Francimar Barroso after dropping 2 fights to Patrick Cummings and Shogun Rua. Now this is a tough fight to call because Gian Villante is the natural light heavyweight. He'll also be fighting with the home crowd advantage, and so that will probably help in any 50-50 situations. He should also have a potential size advantage in this fight as he's a natural light heavyweight, and Sam Alvey was formerly fighting at middleweight, so that could help him if in any grappling situations. This fight could very well end in a KO though, as Gian Villante likes to get into slugfest, and he's going to be looking to put on a fun fight for his home crowd against Smiling Sam Alvey. This fight is super tough to call. I went back and forth on it, but I honestly feel like Sam Alvey's been beating higher level competition and has also shown knockout power at light heavyweight in this most recent fight. So I'm picking Sam Alvey to get the job done in a fun fight, a potential slugfest in enemy territory. I got Smiling Sam Alvey to continue his successful light heavyweight run in the UFC. Next, we've got Julio Arce versus Daniel Tamor, the older brother or the brother of David Tamor, who's fighting on the prelims. You saw we predicted David Tamor to actually get the W, but in this fight, I don't know if his brother Daniel Tamor is going to be able to, keep the family, wins going for the night, as Daniel Tamor is going to have a tougher fight on his hand, I believe. And even if it's not the tougher fight, Daniel Tamor hasn't had as much success in the UFC yet as his brother. David Tamor is 4-0 in the UFC. Daniel Tamor, who's fighting against Arce, is 0-1 in the UFC so far. So with that being said, I'm going to actually be picking Julio Arce. I got one brother winning, one brother losing. I would like to think, that one brother getting the win earlier in the night's going to give his brother some extra motivation to get his own win. But I don't know if that brotherly motivation is going to be enough to beat Julio Arce, who is the younger, more experienced fighter here and is also undefeated in the UFC. Julio Arce is 2-0 in the UFC, so he doesn't have a lot of fights in the UFC. He's also going to be fighting out of New York, so Julio Arce is riding a 6-fight winning streak currently, since losing back-to-back fights to Brian Kelleher, who's now in the UFC. They fought outside the UFC back-to-back. Julio Arce wasn't able to win those fights, but those are his only 2 losses in his career. Brian Kelleher is a top 15 ranked UFC guy right now, bantamweight. So those were 2 losses, but other than that, no one's been able to beat Julio Arce. Daniel Tamor didn't look great in his UFC debut against Danny Henry when he wasn't able to get the first round finish he's accustomed to, as all 6 of Daniel Tamor's wins have came via first round finish. Now, he was visibly tired going into the 3rd round against Danny Henry, So I think the more experienced Julio Arce, if he can avoid being finished in the first round, he should be able to win this fight in front of his home crowd. So I'm going to be picking Julio Arce to get the W versus Daniel Tamor. Now, I'm not 100% confident in that fight. I'm not as confident in that fight as some of the others, because I do think, you know, having his brother on the card is going to maybe help, you know, as far as intangibles are concerned. As far as he's accustomed to getting first round finishes, you know, and a lot of fighters don't necessarily like fighting on the same cards as their family members. You know, some people want to be in their brother's corner and stuff like that, but these fighters are open to it. We saw the Pitbull brothers are open to it. And, you know, me, just as a guy, I just feel like I'm a little biased, man. I've got a fucking brother that's pretty close to me, so I've got a brother. These guys are fucking brothers. I think that's kind of dope. So, I mean, maybe that plays into it. Maybe I'm a little biased in that sense, but I don't know. Also, he's a finisher. That's one thing about Daniel Tamor. Even though he's less experienced and his brother's fighting on the card, he's also a finisher. I think his brother's going to win. So I think he's going to now, but that could also affect him, though. I mean, and this could have nothing to do with the fight as far as his brother being on the card, even though I think it'll play into his mindset. But if his brother loses, then he could definitely come in there with the weird mindset. Like, what if his brother had a pretty bad KO? Of course, he'd have to be able to block that shit out of his brain and come in there and get the fight done, get the job done, still fight. But that could definitely affect his mindset going into this fight. But with that being said, man, I just think Julio Arce is still going to get the job done, man. I think he's going to be the more experienced and be able to avoid the finish. And that's what he's going to have to do to get the job done. Daniel Tamor is 6-1. His only loss is his last fight, which was his UFC debut. All other fights were 6 wins outside the UFC, all 6 finishes in the first round. So, as long as Arce can avoid the first round finish, I think he should be able to get the job done. So we'll see what happens. Also, I think he'll have the better cardio in the fight. If the fight goes to the third round, Arce should be able to take over. So yeah, I got Arce in this fight. With that being said, we're going next to potential fight of the night. Ben Saunders, Killer B versus Jake Ellenberger. I'm going with Jake Ellenberger to get the W here. Jake Ellenberger is the younger, more experienced fighter of the two savvy UFC welterweight veterans. But both fighters are coming off of 2 pretty bad KO losses. Ben Saunders' most recent was to Alan Jobin. Jake Ellenberger's most recent was that kill blow by Mike Perry. Ellenberger has been fighting the best guys in the world since his UFC debut against Carlos Condit back in 2009, the year I graduated. While Killer B has also fought some tough dudes, he hasn't been in the octagon with as high level fighters as Jake Ellenberger, who's also the younger, more experienced fighter. So both of these fighters need to avoid being knocked out in this fight because they're coming off pretty brutal KOs. But I'm going to give the edge to Jake Ellenberger, who I feel like is probably going to be the more well-rounded fighter, also more experienced and even younger. So Killer B's got potential in this fight, but I'm pretty confident in my Jake Ellenberger pick for this fight. So with that being said, I'm going with Walt Harris. We're moving to, now I am going with Walt Harris, but we're moving to Walt Harris versus Daniel Spitz on the main card. I'm going with Walt Harris, as you can see, to win this fight. I'm actually pretty confident in this fight, although it is a heavyweight fight. Don't blink, you know how that goes. But I'm pretty confident in this Walt Harris pick. Walt Harris is riding a deceiving 2-fight losing streak, but one of those losses was to Fabricio Verdum in a fight Walt Harris took on short notice when Fabricio Verdum's original opponent pulled out of the fight. And then Walt Harris was en route to defeating Mark Godbeer when he got disqualified for landing a head kick after a groin shot. But if Walt Harris would have not threw that head kick, he likely continues to dominate that fight. Spitz actually lost to that same guy Godbeer in his UFC debut. But since then, Daniel Spitz KO'd Anthony Hamilton. Anthony Hamilton was on a losing streak at that time. So both of these fighters, though, have fought Mark Godbeer. And Walt Harris had a way better performance against Mark Godbeer. Walt Harris is also the more experienced fighter who's fought a lot of higher level competition. And I believe he should be able to get the W as long as he can avoid being KO'd by the less experienced Daniel Spitz, who has been fighting UFC caliber guys before signing with the UFC and losing to Godbeer, or who hasn't. Daniel Spitz was not fighting guys that were UFC caliber before signing to the UFC, and he hasn't looked great in the UFC. While Walt Harris has looked great in some of his fights in the UFC, he had a rocky intro to the UFC. Walt Harris signed with the UFC like back in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, and lost 3 fights in a row. But then he took 2 years off fought for another organization, came back, and he's looked a lot better in the UFC since then. He has that loss to Fabricio, as I said, and also Mark Godbeer, but both of those are pretty deceiving. So, I mean, he could be 3-1 in the UFC if he didn't take that short notice fight against Verdum, which was a big opportunity. But Fabricio Verdum's a very skilled, one of the best welterweights in the world. So, all that being said, I'm going with Walt Harris and a pretty confident pick there. Next, we've got Gregor Gillespie, fucking the wrestler savage out of New York, fighting in front of his home crowd against Vince Pichel, coming all the way from California. We got some East Coast versus West Coast going on here. Both of these fighters are 4-0 in the UFC. Gregor Gillespie's going to have the home crowd advantage here. Gregor Gillespie's a dominant, undefeated wrestler. He's 11-0 professionally, 4-0 in the UFC, and he's finished his last 3 opponents. He's going to be fighting the older, less active Vince Pichel, who has won 2 fights in a row since taking a 3-year hiatus from the sport, but he's never been taken down in the UFC. But at the same time, he's never fought a wrestler on the level of Gregor Gillespie in the UFC either. So I'm going to be picking Gregor Gillespie to remain undefeated in the co-main event in front of his home crowd and earn a fight with a ranked opponent after this fight. If Gregor Gillespie wins this fight, he will be the first person to defeat Vince Pichel if he scores a takedown in the UFC, I'm saying. If he scores a takedown, he'll be the first person in the UFC to score a takedown on Vince Pichel. And also, if Gregor Gillespie wins this fight, he'll move to 5-0 in the UFC, and he'll definitely be looking for a ranked opponent after that. Also a co-main event. So I think a lot of people are going to have their eye on this fight, and I think Gregor Gillespie is going to shine. I'm pretty confident in that pick as well. With that being said, moving to the main event, holy flying, flipping flapjacks. This fight I did a lot of notes on. This is going to be a great fight. It's such dead even. You could flip a coin on this fight if you don't feel like racking your fucking brain trying to pick a winner. So, I hope you guys are ready. As you can see, my pick is Marlon Moraes. Started off on Jimmy Rivera, went back to Marlon Moraes, back to Jimmy Rivera, back to Marlon Moraes. Such a tough fight to call. It's literally a toss-up on paper. Style-wise, both of these fighters are very well-rounded. So I'm just going to read you guys all of these mother-freaking notes I took on this fight as far as my prediction is concerned. So both of these fighters are fighting out of New Jersey, and so I don't know if anybody's going to have the home crowd advantage here. So this is going to be an evenly matched grudge match between 2 of the best bantamweights in the world. Jimmy Rivera has been wanting a fight that will guarantee him a title shot with either Dominic Cruz, Cody Garbrandt, or TJ Dillashaw, but he wasn't able to. He was going to be fighting Cruz, but Cruz got injured, so instead he's going to be fighting Marlon Moraes, who came to the UFC as the World Series of Fighting bantamweight champion. Marlon Moraes is riding a 2-fight winning streak over Dodson and Aljamain Sterling since losing his UFC debut via split decision to Rafael Assunção in Brazil. A lot of people thought that Marlon Moraes won that fight and got robbed, but same could be said for his fight against Dodson. Some people thought that fight went the other way. So Marlon Moraes has been fighting savages since he got to the UFC. Rafael Assunção has only lost like 1 fight to TJ Dillashaw in his last 10 fights or 12 fights. So Rafael Assunção is a savage. John Dodson, very underrated. And other than that, Marlon Moraes is coming off of that knockout of Aljamain Sterling. So yeah, Marlon Moraes has been very impressive. But Jimmy Rivera is on a 20-fight winning streak since winning his since he won his first pro fight and then he lost, and since then he's on a 20-fight winning streak. Jimmy Rivera is the dark horse of the bantamweight division. A lot of people feel like he's got wins over Uriah Faber, Pedro Munoz, Yuri Alcantara, and most recently Thomas Almeida in a back-and-forth fight of the night contender. Marlon Moraes will probably be one of the best fighters, if not the best fighter Jimmy Rivera has faced to date, as Uriah Faber, very talented Hall of Famer, but whenever he faced Jimmy Rivera, Uriah Faber was already 37 years old, you know, probably not in his prime. So Marlon Moraes is a lot more in his prime, I feel like, also one of the top 5 ranked fighters in the world currently. So I believe Rivera is going to be, is possibly the more well-rounded fighter, possibly. he could score a takedown or two en route to a decision victory. That's the thing about both of these fighters, really. They've been fighting to a lot of decisions. Even though Marlon Moraes' most recent fight was a KO over Aljamain Sterling, it wasn't very intentional, but either way, Jimmy Rivera for sure has been fighting to a lot of decisions. So I could see Jimmy Rivera winning a decision in this fight if he's able to get a takedown or two on Marlon Moraes, but that's not going to be easy. Marlon Moraes might win the striking in this fight. So Marlon Moraes is a very explosive, well-rounded fighter, as we saw with his KO over Aljamain Sterling. So Jimmy Rivera is going to have to, duck his taco, protect his dome, also his body and his legs, because Marlon Moraes throws some pretty fucking nasty kicks as well. Marlon Moraes, as I said, fought to a split decision against Assunção and Dodson. They're both great bantamweight fighters. Neither one of those fights was decisive, though. Marlon Moraes did land a couple of low blows in that John Dodson fight, but still it was arguable. It was a close fight. The referee didn't take any points or anything, and John Dodson's very underrated. He's hard to hit, coming up from flyweight. John Dodson's, in my opinion, one of the most underrated fighters in these lower divisions. He's only lost split decisions in the UFC to guys not named Demetrius Johnson. So that win over John Dodson, or that performance over John Dodson, it wasn't very decisive, but it was still impressive. So with that being said, his fight versus Assunção was also impressive. Wasn't decisive, but I had the fight for Marlon Moraes. And then as far as his win over Aljamain Sterling goes, that was pretty decisive. But still, he admitted in the post-fight, like, I wasn't even going to throw that shot. It connected. It is what it is. But with that being said, Marlon Moraes is still very experienced. He's also in his prime. But Marlon Moraes, as I said, hasn't had any really decisive victories in the UFC thus far. Been fighting straight killers, though. But he's arguably going to be the most prime fighter Jimmy Rivera's ever faced. Also, Jimmy Rivera has been less active as he's been looking for bigger fights, but he's still beaten high-level fighters in the UFC. But all the high-level fighters Jimmy Rivera has beat in the UFC are not necessarily in their prime. As I said, Uriah Faber was 37. Almeida was young, but he had already been KO'd by Cody Garbrandt when he fought Jimmy Rivera. So this is just a really tough fight for me to call, man. So fucking close. Both fighters very well rounded. I honestly feel like I'm giving the edge to Marlon Moraes because he's been more active, fighting higher level competition as of late, and he will also be the best fighter Jimmy Rivera has fought to date. Even though Jimmy Rivera could possibly be the best fighter that Moraes has fought to date. So I feel like Moraes got robbed in the Assunção fight. John Dodson's criminally underrated, so that was still a solid performance. And people don't really enjoy John Dodson's fight. I feel like that's probably why he's a little underrated. But still, he's the magician. He's hard to hit. He's a hard guy to fucking prepare for and a hard guy to figure out. With that being said, I still put stock into that performance for Marlon Moraes. And he's also been more active, as I said. And Jimmy Rivera, he's on a 20-fight winning streak, and he's the dark horse of the division. But whenever you think of the dark horse of the division, you think of somebody that's really like fucking dominating everybody, right? And like Kamaru Usman. Kamaru Usman dominating everybody. People don't want to fight him because they don't want to lose their rank. And when he did fight ranked opponents, we've seen Kamaru Usman dominated them as well. The Damian Maia performance dominated the fight. Now he's a top 5 ranked welterweight. Now Jimmy Rivera is a dark horse of the division, but when he fought Thomas Almeida won. It was a back and forth fight. It was a great fight. Jimmy Rivera won via unanimous decision, but it wasn't super decisive. Some people had the fight for Almeida, or a draw, or however you want to say it. I had the fight for Rivera, but at the same time, it wasn't like a dominant performance. Also, when Jimmy Rivera faced, I believe, Pedro Munoz, maybe the same story. It was a good fight, but it wasn't super decisive. So Jimmy Rivera has had some fun fights, some very entertaining fights with some of these guys, Thomas Almeida, Pedro Munoz's, who might not be on the level of the John Dodsons and the Aljamain Sterlings of the world. So that's why I feel like Marlon Moraes has been fighting the higher competition as of late. And that's why I'm giving the slight edge to Marlon Moraes in this fight. I went back and forth. I could flip a coin. If I had one right now, I would do it just to see what the coin said, but I don't have one in front of me. So with that being said, I'm going with Marlon Moraes at UFC Utica in a very close fight, very fun fight. Can't wait for Jimmy Rivera versus Marlon Moraes, and I honestly would not be super surprised if Jimmy Rivera wins. If Jimmy Rivera does win this fight, then I think it's time for sure for Jimmy Rivera to be getting a title shot or a fight with Cruz, if not a title shot, even though he already had that lined up. But with that being said, Jimmy Rivera also needs to get a finish soon. I mean, he's got a lot of fights, 21 pro wins, and I think like 15 of those might be decisions. And you know how the UFC is on decisions. Not the biggest fan of those, you know what I'm saying? You got to get some highlights and stuff like that. Jimmy Rivera has been in some fun fights, like his last fight versus Thomas Almeida was a back and forth fight. It was a fun fight, but at the same time, still comes out a decision for Jimmy Rivera. So with that being said, I think Marlon Moraes has the explosiveness and the potential to get a KO in this fight. Also, he's very well rounded, so if he can avoid being wrestle fucked by Jimmy Rivera, which I don't look at Jimmy Rivera as somebody that just wrestle fucks everybody or people, but I feel like Jimmy Rivera might have a slight edge on the wrestling, but Marlon Moraes trains with some fucking killers. Eddie Alvarez, Frankie Edgar, and those guys. So Marlon Moraes is a fucking stud. So I'm giving the edge to Marlon Moraes. I can't wait for this fight. I honestly, literally, I just can't wait for this fight because I don't know who's gonna win. And so just by me picking Marlon Moraes, I feel like I'm getting the pick wrong. But if I pick Jimmy Rivera, I would feel wrong too. I feel right about, you know, it's dead even. So I'm giving the edge to Marlon Moraes. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Who do you have? What's your favorite fight of the night on the card? I think the most entertaining fight on the card, one of the funnest, well, yeah, I'll go with Jake Ellenberger versus Ben Saunders, or John Vellante versus Sam Alvey. That John Vellante versus Sam Alvey fight has potential to be very fun. Ellenberger versus Saunders, you got the potential for a pretty nasty KO back and forth fight, some fun striking in that fight. And then of course the main event is probably my favorite fight, but for the casual fans, the entertainment value, that might not play out as a lot of people expect. You know what I'm saying? It might not be as firework, like it might not be a slugfest like Alvey versus Vellante has the potential to be. So I'm looking forward to this card, you know, the main card, and as well as the fight pass prelims and the early fight card. So with that being said, man, it is what it is. Let the full-time family know what you think in the comments. What's your favorite fight? I'm out. And as always, thanks for checking out this video. If you want to join the notification gang, make sure you hit subscribe and also hit the bell next to it so you're notified every time I upload a video. And if you want to help this channel reach its full potential, consider hitting the PayPal link in the description or going to patreon.com/fulltimemma and becoming a patron. I'm out.
This is #1 bullshit.